Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness carry the greatest weight. When you see someone struggling, you help them. It's that simple. Mountain man Caleb Walker sees an old woman walking the trail, her back bent with pain. Without asking questions, he gives her his horse. She rides away into the morning mist, and Caleb walks back to his camp on foot. What he doesn't know is that this woman was once called a witch by the town below. She was cast out years ago, blamed for things she never did. Now she's going back to that same town. She has something to finish, something that's been waiting a long time. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the pine branches as Caleb Walker made his way back up the mountain trail, his boots finding familiar purchase on the rocky path. 3 days had passed since he'd given his horse to the mysterious woman, and he still felt the lightness in his chest that came from doing right by a stranger. His weathered hands gripped the walking stick he'd carved from mountain ash, a faithful companion that had seen him through countless seasons in these Colorado peaks. At 58, Caleb had called these mountains home for the better part of 2 decades. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of aspens, their leaves whispering secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. The structure was solid, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled and stones he'd gathered from the creek bed. Every log bore the mark of deliberate craftsmanship, the kind that came from a man who understood the value of doing things properly the first time. Inside, the cabin reflected a life of purposeful simplicity. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless evenings spent in quiet contemplation. Shelves lined the walls, holding books on everything from wilderness survival to philosophy, their spines worn from repeated reading during long winter nights. On the mantel sat a small wooden cross, hand-carved from the same mountain ash as his walking stick. It wasn't ornate or beautiful in any conventional sense, but it represented something solid in Caleb's life, a reminder that even in solitude, a man wasn't truly alone. The decision to leave civilization hadn't been made lightly. 20 years ago, Caleb had been a different man, married, working as a foreman at the copper mine down in Silver Creek, believing in the promise of progress and prosperity that the mining companies brought to Colorado territory. But progress, he'd learned, often came at a cost too high for decent folks to bear. When the mine had collapsed, taking 17 good men with it, Caleb had seen how quickly those same companies could turn their backs on the families left behind. The owners had blamed faulty equipment they'd refused to replace, unsafe conditions they'd ignored, and ultimately, the men themselves for their own deaths. His wife, Margaret, had tried to understand his growing disillusionment, but grief had carved different paths for each of them. She'd wanted to stay in town, to fight the mine owners through the courts, to make them pay for what they'd done. Caleb had wanted nothing more than to leave it all behind, to find a place where a man's worth wasn't measured in copper ore extracted or profits generated. The mountains had called to him then, promising solitude and honest work under an honest sky. Margaret had stayed. Caleb had left. They'd both been right in their own ways, but right didn't always lead to together. Now, as he prepared his morning coffee over the small wood stove, Caleb reflected on the life he'd built in these peaks. It was a good life, if a quiet one. He trapped in the winter, guided the occasional hunter or surveyor through the high country in the summer, and traded furs and crafted goods at the supply station in Pine Ridge when he needed provisions. The townspeople knew him as reliable, honest, and handy with repairs, the kind of man who kept his word and minded his own business. Pine Ridge sat in the valley below, a growing settlement that served the various mining operations scattered throughout the region. It wasn't much to look at. A main street lined with practical buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of houses where families tried to carve out decent lives in an unforgiving landscape. But it was civilization, and even a man who'd chosen solitude sometimes needed the company of others. Caleb made the journey down to Pine Ridge every few weeks, usually on Sundays, when the church bells could be heard echoing off the mountain walls. He didn't attend services. His relationship with the Almighty was a private matter worked out under open skies, but he respected those who found comfort in community worship. Today felt like a good day for such a visit. His supplies were running low, and he had a handful of carved trinkets that Mrs. Harrison at the general store could sell to travelers passing through. The trail down to Pine Ridge wound through terrain that shifted from alpine forest to scrub brush and finally to the grassland of the valley floor. Caleb knew every twist and turn, every fallen log and seasonal stream. This was his domain, and he moved through it with the confidence of a man at peace with his surroundings. As he approached the outskirts of town, however, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a quality to the conversations he could hear from porches and doorways that spoke of unease. Groups of men stood talking in hushed tones, their voices carrying a weight that hadn't been there during his last visit. At Harrison's general store, the bell above the door announced his arrival with its familiar chime. Mrs. Harrison looked up from behind the counter, her usually cheerful demeanor clouded with worry. "Caleb Walker," she said, managing a smile. "Good to see you. Though I have to say, you picked an interesting time to come calling." "How so, ma'am?" She glanced around the store, though they were alone, and lowered her voice. "Strange happenings lately. Livestock dying for no good reason. The Morrison family's milk cow just dropped dead yesterday morning, healthy as could be the night before. And it's not just them. 3 families now have lost animals, and nobody can explain why." Caleb set his bundle of carved goods on the counter. "Animals die, Mrs. Harrison. Could be any number of reasons. Disease, something they ate, old age. That's what Doc Morrison says, but folks are spooked. And there's other things too." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "People are saying she's back." She? The witch woman, Cordelia Blackthorne. The name fell from her lips like a stone dropped in still water. Been gone nigh on 30 years. But word is, someone matching her description has been seen in the high country. Old woman, traveling alone, keeping to herself. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he couldn't quite name. 30 years is a long time. Could be anyone. Could be, Mrs. Harrison agreed, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it. "Sheriff Dawson's got folks worked up about it. Says if she's really back it means trouble for Pine Ridge. Last time she was here, children died, Caleb. A whole mess of them, taken by some kind of plague that defied all explanation. She tried to help, claimed she could heal them with her herbs and potions, but they died anyway. Town blamed her for it, said she brought the sickness with her dark practices." The carved trinkets in Caleb's hands felt suddenly heavy. He thought of the woman on the trail, her quiet dignity, the way she'd accepted his horse with such grace. Could that have been the same person Mrs. Harrison spoke of with such obvious fear? What makes folks so certain she's back? Strange herbs have been found growing where they shouldn't, plants that don't belong at this altitude, showing up overnight like they were planted by something other than natural means. And there's been sounds in the night, singing, some say, in a language nobody recognizes. Sheriff Dawson says it's witch talk, calling up dark spirits to do her bidding. Through the store's front window, Caleb could see a group of men gathered outside the sheriff's office. Their posture spoke of agitation, of men working themselves up to action. He recognized several faces, miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, ordinary men transformed by fear into something harder and more dangerous. What does Sheriff Dawson plan to do about it? Mrs. Harrison's expression darkened. He's talking about organizing a search party. Says the town has a right to protect itself from evil influences. There's already been talk of taking matters into their own hands if the law won't act fast enough. The bell above the door chimed again as Dr. Morrison entered, his medical bag in hand and his face drawn with exhaustion. He nodded to Caleb and approached the counter with the weariness of a man who'd been fighting battles he couldn't win. "Mrs. Harrison, I need to place an order for more laudanum if you can get it. And any fever remedies you might have in stock? More sick children, doctor?" Morrison's jaw tightened. 3 more cases as of this morning. Same symptoms as the others. High fever, difficulty breathing, spots on the skin. I've never seen anything quite like it, and nothing I try seems to help much. Caleb watched the doctor carefully. Morrison was a good man, educated back east before coming to Colorado Territory to practice frontier medicine. If he was puzzled by the children's illness, it was serious indeed, Doctor, Caleb said carefully. Mrs. Harrison was just telling me about folks thinking this sickness might be connected to supernatural causes. Morrison's expression hardened. Supernatural nonsense. This is a medical condition, not some kind of curse. The problem is, I can't identify the specific cause, which makes treatment difficult. But attributing it to witchcraft helps nobody, and could prevent us from finding a real solution. Try telling that to the parents of sick children, Mrs. Harrison said quietly. Fear makes people look for someone to blame, Doctor. Always has. As if summoned by their conversation, the door opened again to admit Sheriff Dawson. He was a large man, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard years and harder decisions. His eyes swept the store before settling on Caleb. Walker, good to see you in town. You spend more time in the high country than anyone. Seen anything unusual up there lately? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Caleb considered his response carefully, thinking of the woman on the trail, her bent back and quiet acceptance of his kindness. Define unusual, Sheriff. Strange folks passing through. Especially old women traveling alone. Signs of campsites where they shouldn't be. Anything that might suggest someone's taken up residence in areas where decent folks don't usually go. Mountains are big, Sheriff. Lots of places for people to be without being seen. Dawson's eyes narrowed slightly. That's not exactly an answer, Walker. It's the only answer I can give. I mind my own business up there, and I expect others to mind theirs. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. But if you do happen to notice anything at all, I'd appreciate hearing about it. Town's got a right to know about potential threats in the area. After Dawson left, the store fell quiet. Dr. Morrison completed his order and departed with a weary nod. Mrs. Harrison busied herself arranging Caleb's carved goods on a display shelf, her movements carrying the nervous energy of someone trying not to think too hard about unpleasant possibilities. Caleb completed his own purchases, coffee, flour, salt, and a few other necessities, and prepared to leave. As he reached the door, Mrs. Harrison called out to him, "Caleb, be careful up there. Whatever's happening, whatever's causing all this trouble, it's got people scared. And scared people sometimes do things they wouldn't normally consider." Walking back through Pine Ridge, toward the mountain trail, Caleb noticed how many conversations stopped as he passed, how many eyes followed his progress. The town felt like a pot of water just beginning to boil, all nervous energy and building pressure. He thought about Sheriff Dawson's questions, about the sick children, about the fear he'd seen in Mrs. Harrison's eyes. Most of all, he thought about the woman on the trail, her dignity, her pain, the way she'd ridden away into the morning mist without looking back. If she was indeed the person they called Cordelia Blackthorne, if she was the source of Pine Ridge's current fears, then she was in more danger than she might realize. As Caleb began the climb back to his cabin, he found himself wondering if kindness toward a stranger might have consequences he hadn't anticipated. The walking stick felt solid in his grip, but his thoughts were anything but steady as he made his way home through the gathering dusk. 3 days after his visit to Pine Ridge, Caleb woke to find something that shouldn't have been there. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of mountain air that made a man grateful to be alive. Caleb had risen early, as was his custom, to check his snares and gather firewood before the day grew warm. But as he stepped outside his cabin, his eye caught something unusual near the edge of the clearing. A small bundle sat beside the old stump he used for splitting kindling. It hadn't been there the evening before. Caleb was certain of that. He approached it cautiously, his mountain-honed instincts alert for anything out of place. The bundle was wrapped in faded cloth and tied with grass rope. Inside, he found an assortment of dried herbs and roots, some familiar, others completely unknown to him. There were plants that looked like they belonged in warmer climates, varieties that shouldn't have been able to grow at this altitude. The scents were complex and earthy, carrying hints of sage and something sweeter that he couldn't identify. At the bottom of the bundle, wrapped separately in a piece of soft leather, was a small pouch made from worn fabric. It contained what appeared to be prepared medicines, powders and tiny vials of concentrated extracts. Everything was arranged with care, as if by someone who understood the proper way to preserve and present healing herbs. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to indicate who had left it or why. But as Caleb handled the mysterious bundle, he found himself thinking of quiet dignity and weathered hands, gentle on horse reins. He spent the morning trying to convince himself that the herbs were just a coincidence, that any number of travelers might have left them. But when he made his way down to Pine Ridge that afternoon to deliver a repaired harness to the livery stable, he discovered that coincidence was the least of his worries. The town was in chaos. A crowd had gathered outside Dr. Morrison's office, their voices carrying the sharp edge of panic. Parents clutched at children who coughed and wheezed, their small faces flushed with fever. Others stood in worried clusters, exchanging fearful whispers about symptoms that seemed to be spreading faster than anyone could track. Caleb pushed through the crowd to find Morrison emerging from his office. His shirt sleeves rolled up and his face grim with exhaustion. "Doctor, what's happening here?" Morrison looked up, relief flickering across his features at seeing a familiar, calm face in the sea of anxiety. 7 children now, Caleb, all showing the same symptoms: high fever, respiratory distress, and a distinctive rash that appears overnight. "I've never seen anything progress this quickly. Any idea what's causing it?" "None whatsoever. I've checked the water supply, examined their food, looked for any common exposure that might explain it. Nothing. It's as if the illness appeared out of thin air." Morrison's voice dropped lower. "And that's exactly what has everyone so spooked." Through the crowd, Caleb could hear fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. Words like punishment and evil influence drifted through the air, spoken by people whose fear was rapidly transforming into something darker and more dangerous. "Where's Sheriff Dawson?" Caleb asked. "Inside the church with Reverend Phillips and some of the town leaders. They've been meeting for the past hour, and from what I've heard, they're not discussing medical solutions." The church doors opened as if summoned by their conversation, and Sheriff Dawson emerged with a group of men Caleb recognized as prominent members of the community. Their faces were set with the grim determination of people who believed they'd found an answer to their problems. Dawson raised his voice to address the crowd. "Folks, we've made a decision about how to handle this situation. The evidence is clear that what's happening to our children isn't natural. Too many strange occurrences, too many unexplained events for this to be ordinary sickness." A murmur ran through the crowd, part fear, part anticipation. "We know who's responsible," Dawson continued. "The witch woman has returned to our mountains, and she's brought her dark practices with her. As long as she remains in our territory, our children will continue to suffer. What are you planning to do about it?" Called out Tom Henderson, whose 6-year-old daughter was among the sick. "We're organizing a search party to find her and put an end to this threat once and for all. Every able-bodied man who wants to protect his family is welcome to join. We'll start at first light tomorrow." Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. He thought of the herbs left outside his cabin, of the woman's quiet dignity as she'd accepted his horse. Whatever was happening to the children of Pine Ridge, he couldn't believe that the person he'd helped was responsible for their suffering. But as he looked around at the faces in the crowd, he saw that his opinion would be distinctly in the minority. Fear had taken hold of Pine Ridge, and fear was looking for someone to blame. "Sheriff," Dr. Morrison called out, his voice carrying over the crowd, "I must protest this course of action. We're dealing with a medical emergency, not supernatural persecution. Organizing armed groups to hunt down suspected witches is something that belongs in the Dark Ages, not in a civilized territory." Dawson's expression hardened. "With respect, Doctor, your modern medicine hasn't done much to help these children. Maybe it's time to consider that some problems require older solutions. Reverend Philip stepped forward, his thin frame making him appear even more austere than usual. The Lord's word is clear about those who practice dark arts. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. If we allow evil to flourish in our midst, we invite judgment upon our entire community. The crowd's murmur grew louder, more agitated. Caleb could see the dangerous momentum building, the way individual fears were coalescing into collective action. This was how lynch mobs formed, how ordinary people convinced themselves that violence was not only justified, but necessary. Dr. Morrison makes a good point, Caleb said, his voice cutting through the crowd noise. Might be worth considering all possibilities before we start hunting people based on superstition. Dawson's eyes fixed on him with sudden intensity. You got something specific in mind, Walker? Or are you just here to complicate things? Caleb felt the weight of dozens of stares, saw the suspicion beginning to form in faces that had always treated him with respect. He realized he was walking a dangerous line. Too much defense of the unknown woman would mark him as suspect in their eyes. Just saying we should be sure of our facts before we take action we can't undo. Facts. Tom Henderson's voice cracked with emotion. My little girl is burning up with fever, and you want to talk about facts? Something evil is in these mountains, and it's killing our children. That's fact enough for me. The crowd voiced its agreement with Henderson, their collective anger drowning out any voice of reason that might have emerged. Caleb realized that any chance for rational discussion had passed. Pine Ridge had made up its mind, and tomorrow they would go hunting for a woman whose only crime might have been accepting help from a stranger. As the crowd began to disperse, people drifting away to prepare for the morning's hunt, Caleb found himself walking beside Dr. Morrison toward the edge of town. This is madness, Morrison said quietly. Even if this woman exists, even if she's somehow connected to the children's illness, a lynch mob isn't going to solve anything. Doctor, you said you'd never seen symptoms like these before. Any chance they might respond to herbal treatments? Traditional remedies that wouldn't be in your medical books? Morrison glanced at him sharply. What makes you ask that? Caleb chose his words carefully. Just wondering if there might be knowledge out there that could help these children. Knowledge that might be getting overlooked in all the fear and anger. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. Just asking if you'd be open to unconventional solutions if they might save lives. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his steps slowing as they reached the outskirts of town. Finally he spoke. If someone, hypothetically speaking, had access to treatments that might help these children, I would be willing to consider any option that offered hope. My oath is to do no harm and to preserve life. Everything else is secondary to that, Caleb nodded, filing the doctor's words away for future consideration. As he began the long walk back to his cabin, his mind was already working through possibilities and consequences. The herbs left outside his cabin suddenly seemed less mysterious and more like a message, or perhaps an invitation. By the time he reached his clearing, Caleb had made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, while the men of Pine Ridge searched the mountains for a witch to blame, he would be searching for a woman who might hold the key to saving their children. Whether that made him a hero or a traitor remained to be seen. Dawn came too early and brought with it the sound of voices echoing up from the valley, Sheriff Dawson's search party assembling in Pine Ridge. Caleb had been awake for an hour, studying the mysterious herbs by lamplight and preparing for his own journey into the high country. Whatever was about to unfold, he intended to find the woman before the lynch mob did. The bundle of herbs had yielded more secrets in the pre-dawn darkness. Several of the plants were varieties Caleb recognized from his years trapping in different climates, medicines his grandmother had used for fevers and respiratory ailments. Others remained mysteries, but their careful preparation suggested someone with deep knowledge of healing arts. This wasn't the random collection of a wandering eccentric. It was the precisely assembled kit of a true healer. Caleb packed light for the journey ahead. Dried meat, coffee, his rifle, and the mysterious herbs wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. His tracking skills were rusty but not forgotten, honed during 20 years of following game trails through terrain that could kill the careless or unprepared. If the woman was still in these mountains, he would find her. The trail he chose led away from Pine Ridge into the deeper wilderness where few people ventured except during hunting season. It was rough country, scarred by ancient avalanches and carved by streams that ran cold even in summer. Perfect territory for someone who wanted to remain hidden from prying eyes. 3 hours into his journey, Caleb found the first sign. A small cairn of stones sat beside the trail, arranged with deliberate precision that spoke of human hands rather than natural formation. It pointed toward a game path that branched off into dense timber, barely visible unless a person knew what to look for. Caleb had passed this same spot dozens of times over the years without noticing anything unusual. But now, the stone marker seemed to pulse with significance. The game path led upward through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, following the natural contours of the mountainside. It was old, worn by generations of deer and elk seeking water and shelter, but recent signs suggested larger, two-legged traffic. Bootprints in soft earth, broken branches at human height, the occasional scuff mark on stones. Someone had passed this way within the last few days. As Caleb climbed higher, the forest around him began to feel different. The usual sounds of wildlife were muted, replaced by an almost cathedral-like silence that seemed to muffle even his own footsteps. Birds that should have been calling from the treetops were nowhere to be heard. Even the wind seemed hushed, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Another cairn marked a fork in the trail, this one pointing toward what appeared to be impenetrable brush. But when Caleb pushed through the undergrowth, he discovered a hidden passage that led into a narrow canyon he'd never known existed. The walls rose on either side like cathedral pillars, creating a natural corridor that wound deeper into the heart of the mountain. Here, the signs of recent passage became unmistakable. Someone had definitely used this route, and recently. Bootprints showed clearly in the sandy soil along the canyon floor, accompanied by what looked like the hoofprints of his own horse. Caleb felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. He was on the right trail, but what would he find at the end of it? The canyon opened into a hidden valley that took Caleb's breath away. It was like discovering a secret room in a house he'd lived in for years, a perfect circle of meadowland surrounded by towering peaks, with a crystal-clear stream meandering through its center. Ancient pines provided shelter along the edges, their massive trunks speaking of centuries undisturbed by human activity. But it wasn't entirely undisturbed now. Smoke rose from a small, carefully tended fire near the stream's edge. His horse, the one he'd given to the mysterious woman, grazed peacefully in the meadow grass, its reins trailing loose in the mountain tradition that said a horse trained right would never wander far from food and water. And there, sitting beside the fire with her back straight, despite her obvious age, was the woman herself. She looked up as Caleb emerged from the canyon entrance, her eyes showing neither surprise nor alarm. It was as if she'd been expecting him, had perhaps seen him coming long before he'd spotted her smoke. Up close, in the clear mountain light, she appeared both older and more vital than he'd initially thought. Her hair was silver-white and braided with small beads that caught the sunlight, her face deeply lined but alert with intelligence. She wore practical mountain clothing, wool and leather that had seen hard use but was well maintained. "Mr. Walker," she said in a voice that carried the unmistakable cadence of education and refinement. "I wondered when you might come calling." Caleb approached slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we need to talk. About the children in Pine Ridge." Her directness caught him off guard. "Among other things, how did you—" "Word travels in the mountains, Mr. Walker, even to those who prefer solitude." She gestured to a flat stone near the fire. "Please sit. We have much to discuss, and perhaps little time for lengthy conversations." Caleb settled onto the makeshift seat, studying the woman's face for clues to her true nature. What he saw was weariness, tempered by determination, sadness balanced by resolve. Whatever else she might be, she didn't look like someone who would harm children. "They're calling you Cordelia Blackthorne down in Pine Ridge," he said carefully. "Saying you're responsible for what's happening to their young ones?" A shadow passed across her features. Cordelia Blackthorne. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in many years. She looked into the fire for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "Yes, Mr. Walker, that was indeed my name once upon a time. Was. Names can become burdens, Mr. Walker. Sometimes it's easier to set them aside and find simpler ways of moving through the world." Around the campsite, Caleb could see evidence of organized activity. Herbs hung drying from improvised racks. Small pots contained what appeared to be brewing medicines, and a leather satchel lay open to reveal an array of bottles and powders arranged with professional precision. This was clearly the workspace of someone who understood healing arts. "Those herbs you left outside my cabin, they're for the sick children, aren't they?" She nodded slowly. "Children are dying, Mr. Walker. Whatever else the people of Pine Ridge might think of me, I cannot stand by while innocents suffer." "Then you know what's causing their illness?" "I know what it isn't. It isn't witchcraft or supernatural punishment or divine judgment. It's something far more mundane and far more dangerous. The kind of evil that men do to each other in pursuit of profit." Her words carried a weight that suggested painful experience. Caleb found himself leaning forward, drawn by the certainty in her voice. "You've seen this before. 30 years ago, in that same town, children died with these same symptoms. I tried to help them then, just as I'm trying to help them now. The difference is that 30 years ago, I was young enough to believe that truth and good intentions were sufficient protection against fear and greed." The implications of her words settled over Caleb like a cold wind. If she was telling the truth, then the current crisis was connected to events from decades past, events that had apparently cost her dearly. What really happened 30 years ago? Cordelia's expression grew distant, as if she were looking through the mountains to another time entirely. "That, Mr. Walker, is a story that could get us both killed if the wrong people hear it being told." The fire crackled between them as Cordelia reached into her leather satchel and withdrew something wrapped in faded silk. Her movements were deliberate, careful, as if she were handling something precious beyond measure. When she unwrapped the object, Caleb saw that it was a daguerreotype, one of those early photographs that captured images in silver and shadow. The image showed a younger woman who was unmistakably Cordelia, perhaps 30 years of age, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Between them stood 2 children, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. All 4 faces radiated happiness, the kind of joy that came from belonging to something larger than themselves. "My family," Cordelia said simply, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph with infinite tenderness. "Thomas was my husband. The children were Samuel and little Anna." Her voice caught slightly on the girl's name. "This was taken just months before they died." Caleb studied the photograph, seeing in it the ghost of dreams destroyed and lives cut short. "I'm sorry for your loss. They were everything to me, Mr. Walker. Thomas was the kindest man I ever knew, a teacher by profession but a healer by nature. He believed that knowledge should be shared, that learning could lift people out of poverty and superstition. The children had his gentle spirit and his quick minds." She rewrapped the photograph carefully and returned it to her satchel before continuing. "We lived in Pine Ridge during the boom years, when the mining companies first arrived and promised prosperity for everyone. Thomas taught the children of miners and ranchers alike, while I practiced the healing arts my grandmother had taught me. We were happy, Mr. Walker. We were building something good. What changed? The mine started having problems. Equipment failures, cave-ins, contaminated water supplies. Men were getting sick and some were dying. The company brought in new managers, men who cared more about production quotas than safety standards. When workers complained, they were told to accept the risks or find other employment." Caleb nodded grimly. He'd seen similar situations during his own mining days. companies that viewed workers as expendable resources rather than human beings. Then the children started getting sick, Cordelia continued. Not just mining families, but everyone in town. The same symptoms we're seeing now: fever, breathing difficulties, skin rashes that appeared overnight. The town doctor was baffled and people were desperate for answers. So they turned to you. I had some success treating similar ailments in the past. Using herbal remedies my grandmother had passed down through our family. Some children improved under my care, but others— She paused, staring into the fire. Others died despite everything I tried, including my own. The weight of her confession settled between them like a physical presence. Caleb found himself imagining the anguish of a mother watching her own children succumb to an illness she couldn't cure. Despite all her knowledge and desperate efforts, people grieve differently, he said quietly. Sometimes they need someone to blame. Blame was the least of it. When my children died, when several others followed despite my treatments, certain people in town began spreading stories. They said I was a witch, that my herbs and remedies were actually curses designed to harm rather than heal. They claimed I had caused the plague to punish the town for some imagined slight. And your husband, didn't he defend you? Cordelia's expression darkened with old pain. Thomas tried. He stood up in church and spoke about my true character, about all the people I had helped over the years. He presented evidence that the illness was connected to contaminated water from the mining operations, not supernatural causes. For his trouble, he was branded a collaborator with evil forces. The implications of what she wasn't saying began to dawn on Caleb. They killed him. They called it an accident. Thomas was supposedly thrown from his horse while riding to the territorial capital to petition for an investigation of the mining company. But I saw his body, Mr. Walker. I saw what they had done to him. That was no riding accident. The bitterness in her voice was matched by a steely resolve that spoke of years spent nurturing plans for justice. Caleb began to understand why she had returned to Pine Ridge after 3 decades of exile. What happened to you after that? I was given a choice: leave Pine Ridge forever or face trial for witchcraft and murder. The mining company had enough influence to ensure that any trial would end with my execution, so I chose exile. I took what I could carry and disappeared into the mountains for 30 years. I traveled extensively, Mr. Walker. I learned from healers and medicine people throughout the West, expanding my knowledge of natural remedies and traditional treatments. I studied with a Cherokee medicine woman in Oklahoma, learned from Mexican curanderas along the Rio Grande, even spent time with Chinese herbalists in California. I became the healer I should have been when my own children needed me. She stood and walked to where the herbs hung drying, touching them with the reverence of someone who understood their true power. But I never forgot Pine Ridge, and I never stopped believing that someday I would return to finish what Thomas started, exposing the truth about what really killed those children. What makes you think the truth would matter now? 30 years is a long time. People move on, circumstances change. Cordelia turned back to face him, her eyes blazing with conviction. Because the same people are involved, Mr. Walker. Oh, some have died or moved away, but the mining company is still there, still cutting corners, still poisoning the land and water for profit. And Sheriff Dawson was a young deputy 30 years ago, one of the men who helped frame me and murder my husband. The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. Dawson had seemed like a typical frontier lawman, rough around the edges, but fundamentally decent. The idea that he might be complicit in murder and conspiracy challenged everything Caleb thought he knew about the man. You're certain? I remember his face very clearly, Mr. Walker. Some memories don't fade, no matter how much time passes. He was the one who found Thomas's body, the one who swore it was a riding accident, despite evidence to the contrary. He was also the one who threatened to arrest me if I didn't leave town immediately. Caleb absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the Sheriff Dawson he knew with the corrupt deputy Cordelia described. If that's true, then you're walking into a trap by coming back. Dawson has a search party out looking for you right now, and they're not planning to bring you back for a fair trial. I know the risks. But those children are dying, Mr. Walker, and I may be the only person alive who knows how to save them. More importantly, I may be the only one willing to expose the real source of their illness. She returned to her seat by the fire and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting and detailed sketches. I've been investigating the current outbreak since I arrived. The symptoms are identical to what we saw 30 years ago, and the timing is suspicious. Word has reached me that the mining company is planning a major expansion of their operations. New shafts, new equipment, new methods of extracting ore from previously untouchable deposits. You think they're poisoning the water supply again? I think they're doing exactly what they did before. Cutting costs by disposing of toxic materials in the most convenient way possible, regardless of the consequences for the local population. The difference is that this time, I have the knowledge and experience to prove it. Caleb studied her face, seeing determination tempered by wisdom earned through decades of suffering and learning. Whatever else Cordelia Blackthorne might be, she was no crazy old woman seeking revenge through supernatural means. She was a skilled healer with legitimate grievances and specific knowledge about ongoing criminal activity. What do you need from me? I need someone the townspeople trust, someone who can move freely in Pine Ridge without arousing suspicion. I need an ally who understands that saving those children is more important than protecting powerful interests. You want me to be your spy. I want you to be my partner in preventing more deaths, both the children who are currently sick and the innocent woman who will be murdered if that lynch mob finds her before we can expose the truth. The weight of the decision pressed down on Caleb like the mountain air itself. He thought of the fear he'd seen in the faces of Pine Ridge parents, the determination in Sheriff Dawson's eyes, the careful way Mrs. Harrison had spoken about supernatural threats. Getting involved would mean taking sides in a conflict where the stakes couldn't be higher. But he also thought of the children's fevered faces, of Dr. Morrison's exhausted frustration, of the quiet dignity with which this woman had accepted his horse and his kindness. Sometimes a man had to choose between safety and what was right. Tell me what you need me to do. The next morning, Caleb made his way back to Pine Ridge, with Cordelia's carefully prepared medicines hidden in his pack and a story rehearsed in his mind. The search party had returned empty-handed the previous evening, their failure only intensifying the town's sense of frustrated urgency. Now, as he walked the familiar streets, Caleb could feel the weight of suspicious glances following his every move. At the general store, Mrs. Harrison greeted him with obvious relief. Caleb, thank goodness you're safe. We were worried when you didn't come down with the search party yesterday. Had my own business to attend to in the high country, he replied, maintaining the careful balance between truth and deception that Cordelia had coached him on. Heard you folks didn't find what you were looking for. Sheriff Dawson is beside himself. Says the witch woman is more cunning than anyone expected, that she's using dark arts to hide her trail from honest men. Mrs. Harrison lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between you and me, some folks are starting to wonder if she might have help. The implied accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Caleb kept his expression carefully neutral while his mind raced through the implications. If the townspeople were already suspicious of potential collaborators, his position was more precarious than he'd realized. Help from who? Well, you spend more time in those mountains than anyone else. Sheriff's been asking questions about whether you might have seen something you haven't reported. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The sheriff thinks I'm hiding something? He thinks someone is. Too many strange coincidences, too many unexplained events. And now the children are getting worse instead of better. The mention of worsening conditions sent urgency shooting through Caleb's chest. According to Cordelia's plan, he was supposed to approach Dr. Morrison with her prepared medicines, claiming he'd found them in an abandoned prospector's cabin. The story was thin, but it was the only way to get her remedies to the sick children without revealing her presence. How much worse? Mrs. Harrison's expression grew grave. 2 more children fell ill overnight, and little Sarah Mitchell, Tom Henderson's niece, she's barely breathing. Doc Morrison's talking about sending for a specialist from Denver, but that could take weeks, even if we could afford it. The weight of children's lives pressed down on Caleb's shoulders as he made his way toward Dr. Morrison's office. Each step felt like a choice between loyalty to his community and loyalty to what he believed was right. By the time he reached the doctor's door, he'd made peace with the consequences of his decision. Morrison looked up from his medical journals with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man fighting a losing battle. His usually immaculate office showed signs of the chaos that had consumed his recent days. Papers scattered across his desk, medical supplies hastily unpacked and abandoned, the sharp smell of disinfectant failing to mask an underlying odor of sickness and fear. Caleb, unless you're here with a miracle cure, I'm afraid I don't have much time for social visits. Funny you should mention that. Doc. Caleb set his pack on the examination table and began carefully removing Cordelia's wrapped medicines. Found something up in the high country yesterday that you might want to take a look at. Morrison's attention sharpened as Caleb unwrapped the carefully prepared remedies. The doctor's trained eye immediately recognized the professional quality of the preparations. These weren't the crude folk remedies of an amateur herbalist, but precisely formulated medicines created by someone with extensive knowledge of healing arts. Where exactly did you find these? Old prospector's cabin about 15 miles northeast of here. Place has been abandoned for years, but there was a cache hidden in the walls. Looks like whoever lived there knew a thing or two about treating respiratory ailments. Morrison picked up one of the small bottles and held it to the light, studying the clarity of the liquid within. These are incredibly well preserved. And the formulations. He paused, opening the bottle to smell its contents. This is sophisticated work, Caleb. Whoever prepared these had medical training well beyond what you'd expect from a frontier prospector. Question is, could they help our sick children? The doctor was already moving toward his reference books, his excitement growing as he recognized ingredients and preparation methods. Some of these compounds are mentioned in traditional healing texts I studied back east. They were used to treat respiratory infections before modern medicines became available. The theory was sound, but I've never seen them prepared with this level of precision, so you're willing to try them. Morrison hesitated, the weight of professional responsibility warring with desperate hope in his expression. The children are dying, Caleb. At this point, I'm willing to consider any treatment that might offer them relief, as long as it won't cause additional harm. How can you tell if they're safe? I can analyze the components, test them for known toxins, start with small doses on the least critical patients. Morrison was already organizing the medicines according to his own system, his scientific mind engaging with the problem. If these really are traditional remedies for respiratory ailments, they might complement the treatments I'm already using. While Morrison worked, Caleb found himself studying the office more carefully. On the desk, partially hidden beneath medical journals, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A tarnished badge that clearly didn't belong to the current sheriff's office. The badge was old, its silver surface blackened with age and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. Around its edges, Caleb could make out partial lettering that seemed to spell deputy in an obsolete style that predated Dawson's current position. It sat beneath a stack of papers like a paperweight, or perhaps like a trophy. Doc, that's an interesting badge you've got there. Morrison glanced up from his analysis, following Caleb's gaze to the desk. For just a moment, something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. Found it in some old files I was sorting through. Belonged to a deputy who served here years ago before my time. Thought it might be worth keeping as a historical curiosity. The explanation felt rehearsed, too casual for something that had clearly been hidden beneath papers until Caleb's arrival disturbed them. As Morrison continued his work with the medicines, Caleb found himself wondering what other secrets might be hidden in the doctor's office. and whether his ally in saving the children might not be as trustworthy as he'd assumed, but those concerns had to wait. Whatever Morrison's potential connection to past events, he was currently the only hope for getting Cordelia's medicines to the children who needed them. The immediate crisis took precedence over historical mysteries, even if those mysteries might hold the key to preventing future tragedies. How long before you know if the medicines will help? Give me tonight to analyze them properly, and I can start treatments tomorrow morning. If they work, if they really work, we could see improvement within hours. As Caleb prepared to leave, Morrison called out to him, "Caleb, if you happen to find any more caches like this one, anything that might help these children, I hope you'll bring them to me immediately. We can't afford to let pride or protocol stand in the way of saving lives." Walking back through Pine Ridge in the gathering dusk, Caleb reflected on the complexity of the situation he'd stumbled into. Cordelia might be the key to saving the children, but she was also a woman marked for death by fearful townspeople. Morrison might be their best hope for medical treatment, but he was clearly hiding secrets that could be connected to the very conspiracy Cordelia sought to expose. And somewhere in the growing darkness, Sheriff Dawson was planning his next move in a game where the stakes were measured in children's lives and the currency was decades-old guilt and corruption. Sleep came hard that night, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of silver badges stained with blood and children's voices calling out from shadows that had no source. Caleb woke before dawn with the uncomfortable feeling that he was being watched, but when he stepped outside his cabin, he found only the usual mountain silence and the first pale light of morning filtering through the pine branches. Still, something felt different. The forest carried a tension that hadn't been there the day before, as if the very air was holding its breath. Even the birds seemed reluctant to begin their morning songs, and the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was notably absent. Caleb was brewing his morning coffee when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Two riders were making their way up the mountain trail, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew exactly where they were going. Through the trees, he could make out Sheriff Dawson's distinctive figure. Accompanied by a younger man Caleb recognized as Deputy Collins, they reined in at the edge of his clearing, their horses breathing hard from the steep climb. Dawson's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Morning, Walker. Mind if we step down and have a word? Your horses look like they could use the rest. Help yourself to water from the stream." As the two men dismounted and began tending to their animals, Caleb noticed that both wore their guns loose in their holsters and kept glancing around the clearing as if expecting trouble. Whatever had brought them up the mountain, it wasn't good news. "Appreciate you taking the time to see us," Dawson said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that seemed steadier than his eyes. "Got some questions that need answering, and you're about the only man who might have the information we need. Happy to help if I can. Yesterday, Dr. Morrison received some medicine that's already showing promise with the sick children. Claims he got it from you, said you found it in an abandoned prospector's cabin." Dawson's gaze never left Caleb's face as he spoke. "Thing is, I've been sheriff in these parts for 15 years, and I know every abandoned structure within 50 miles of Pine Ridge. Can't think of any prospector's cabin that fits the description you gave." Caleb felt the trap closing around him, but kept his expression neutral. "Mountains are full of places most folks never see, Sheriff. Just because you haven't been somewhere doesn't mean it's not there." "That's true enough," Deputy Collins interjected. "But it's also true that the medicine Dr. Morrison received was prepared by someone with advanced knowledge of healing arts. Not exactly what you'd expect from a long-dead prospector." The younger man's observation was sharper than Caleb had given him credit for. Collins might look like a typical frontier deputy, but he clearly possessed investigative skills that made him dangerous to anyone trying to maintain a deception. "Are you suggesting I'm lying about where I found those medicines?" Caleb asked, letting a note of offended dignity creep into his voice. "I'm suggesting that someone in this area has been helping the witch woman Dawson replied bluntly. Someone's been providing her with supplies, information, maybe even shelter, and that someone is going to answer for it when we catch them. The threat was unmistakable, but Caleb had faced down more dangerous men than Sheriff Dawson during his mining days. He met the sheriff's stare without flinching. "If you're accusing me of something, Sheriff, you'd better have evidence to back it up. Evidence has a way of appearing when you know where to look for it," Collins said quietly. "And we've got all day to look." The implication was clear. They intended to search his cabin and the surrounding area. If they found any trace of Cordelia's presence, any indication that he'd been in contact with her, his usefulness to her cause would end along with his freedom. "You're welcome to look around," Caleb said, gesturing toward his cabin. "But I'd appreciate knowing what specific crime you think I've committed." "Aiding and abetting a known fugitive," Dawson replied without hesitation. "Interfering with a lawful investigation. Conspiracy to practice witchcraft." He paused, letting the weight of the accusations settle. "Any one of those charges could get you a long stretch in territorial prison, Walker. All three together. Well, let's just say judges don't look kindly on men who endanger children." While Dawson spoke, Collins had begun a methodical examination of the cabin's exterior, paying particular attention to areas where someone might have hidden supplies or evidence of recent visitors. His trained eye missed nothing: footprints in soft earth, disturbed vegetation, even the subtle signs that would indicate whether Caleb had been entertaining guests. Inside the cabin, Dawson's search was equally thorough. He examined every shelf, opened every container, even checked the spaces between floorboards for hidden compartments. But Caleb had been careful to remove all traces of Cordelia's visit, and the sheriff found nothing more incriminating than a man's natural collection of wilderness gear and survival supplies. "Clean as a whistle," Collins reported when they'd finished their examination. "If he's been helping anyone, he's covered his tracks well." Dawson's frustration was evident in the tight set of his jaw and the way his hands kept drifting toward his gun. "That doesn't mean he's innocent, just careful. The guilty ones always are." "Sheriff," Caleb said carefully, "I understand you're under pressure to solve this situation, but accusing innocent people isn't going to help those sick children. Seems like your time might be better spent looking for real solutions instead of imaginary conspiracies." "Real solutions?" Dawson's voice carried a bitter edge. "I'll tell you about real solutions, Walker. 30 years ago, this same town faced the same problem. Children dying from mysterious illnesses, strange occurrences that defied explanation. You know how we solved it then. We drove out the source of the problem. We made it clear that Pine Ridge wouldn't tolerate evil influences in our midst." The admission hung in the air like gun smoke. Caleb could see that Dawson realized he'd said more than he'd intended, revealed knowledge that a man of his supposed background shouldn't possess. The sheriff's expression hardened as he recognized his mistake. "Of course, I was just a deputy then," Dawson added quickly. "But I learned from men who knew how to handle these situations. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work." Collins had been listening to the exchange with growing interest, and now he spoke up with a question that surprised them both. "Sheriff, if the same situation happened 30 years ago, and if it was solved by driving out the source, then how come it's happening again? Seems like maybe the original solution wasn't as permanent as folks thought." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Dawson's face flushed red, and for a moment Caleb thought the sheriff might actually draw his weapon. Instead, he turned abruptly toward his horse. "We're wasting time here, Collins. If Walker's involved in this mess, we'll prove it eventually. But right now, we've got bigger problems to worry about." As they prepared to leave, Dawson turned back to Caleb with a final warning. "Stay close to home for the next few days, Walker. If anything else happens, if any more mysterious medicines appear, if anyone else claims to have found helpful supplies in convenient locations, I'm going to assume you're involved, whether I can prove it or not." After they rode away, Caleb stood in his clearing for a long time, thinking about the implications of what he'd just heard. Dawson's slip about having been a deputy 30 years ago confirmed Cordelia's story. But it also suggested that the sheriff knew more about the current situation than he was admitting publicly. More troubling was Deputy Collins's pointed question about the permanence of past solutions. The young lawman was clearly thinking beyond the supernatural explanations that satisfied most of the townspeople, and that made him potentially dangerous to everyone involved in the current conspiracy. As the sun climbed higher, Caleb realized that time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. The truth about Pine Ridge's past was beginning to surface despite 30 years of careful burial, and when it finally emerged completely, the consequences would reach far beyond one woman's quest for justice. 2 days later, driven by an instinct he couldn't quite name, Caleb found himself exploring areas of the mountains he'd avoided for years. There was something about Deputy Collins's questions that had lodged in his mind like a splinter, refusing to be ignored. If the same situation had occurred 30 years ago, and if it had been solved by driving out Cordelia, then why was it happening again? What had really caused the original outbreak, and what was causing the current one? The answer, when he found it, lay in a place he'd never thought to look. The old Consolidated Mining Company office sat in a narrow canyon about 12 miles from Pine Ridge, abandoned for the better part of a decade after the company had moved their operations to more profitable locations. Caleb had passed the deteriorating buildings countless times without giving them much thought. They were just another example of the boom and bust cycle that characterized mining in Colorado territory, but today, something made him stop and take a closer look. The main office building was a 2-story structure built from local stone and timber, designed to project an image of permanence and prosperity that had ultimately proved illusory. Most of the windows were broken, and the roof showed signs of serious weather damage, but the basic structure remained sound. It was the kind of place where important documents might have been stored and then forgotten when the company pulled out. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, and Caleb had no difficulty entering what had once been the nerve center of a major industrial operation. Inside, debris covered everything: broken furniture, scattered papers, the detritus of hasty abandonment. But in the back office, behind a door that had swollen shut with moisture and neglect, Caleb discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about Pine Ridge's history. A massive safe stood against the far wall, its door hanging open to reveal shelves lined with document boxes and file folders. Most contained routine business correspondence and financial records, but one file drawer held materials that made Caleb's blood run cold. The first document he examined was a land deed dated 1851, transferring ownership of a substantial tract of land from Thomas and Cordelia Blackthorne to Consolidated Mining Company. The transfer price was listed as $1 and other valuable considerations, the kind of language that usually indicated the sale wasn't entirely voluntary. But it was the notation in the margin that caught Caleb's attention. Original owners deceased as of March 15, 1851. Property acquired by right of survivorship pending legal resolution. Cordelia had told him that her family died during the plague outbreak of 1851, but this document suggested something far more sinister. If the mining company had acquired their land immediately following their deaths, it implied a level of coordination that went well beyond coincidence. The next file contained correspondence between company officials and local law enforcement, including several letters signed by Deputy Sheriff J. Dawson. The letters discussed resolving the Blackthorne situation and ensuring that no legal complications arise from the property transfer. One particularly damning document outlined a payment schedule to local officials in exchange for their cooperation in maintaining public order during the transition period, but it was the final document in the file that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. A detailed report from a company engineer described the deliberate contamination of Pine Ridge's water supply with mining waste containing high levels of mercury and arsenic. The report noted that temporary illness among the local population is an acceptable cost for maintaining operational efficiency, and recommended that any investigation into health effects be discouraged through appropriate channels. The report was dated March 10th, 1851, 5 days before the Blackthorn. Family's supposed death from plague, Caleb sank into a rotting chair as the implications washed over him. Cordelia's family hadn't died from disease, they'd been murdered to facilitate a land grab. The plague outbreak had been deliberate poisoning designed to weaken community resistance to the mining company's expansion. And Cordelia herself had survived only because she'd been away from home when the contamination reached its peak concentration. But there was more. A separate folder contained plans for a new contamination operation dated just 3 months ago. The Consolidated Mining Company was planning to resume operations in the Pine Ridge area, and they intended to use the same methods that had worked so effectively 30 years earlier. The current outbreak of childhood illness wasn't a coincidence or a supernatural occurrence. It was the beginning of a new campaign of deliberate poisoning designed to drive down property values and eliminate opposition to mining expansion. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity: create a health crisis that would panic the local population, encourage them to blame supernatural causes rather than industrial ones, then offer to purchase their land at below-market prices as families fled the area seeking healthier environments for their children. Any residents who resisted could be dealt with through legal pressure or more direct methods. And Sheriff Dawson, now 30 years older and considerably more powerful than he'd been as a deputy, was once again being paid to ensure that no inconvenient investigations disrupted the company's plans. A sound from outside the building interrupted Caleb's horrified fascination with the documents. Horses were approaching, multiple riders moving at a steady pace that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. Caleb quickly gathered the most important documents and stuffed them inside his jacket, then moved to a broken window where he could observe the canyon entrance. Sheriff Dawson rode into the canyon, accompanied by 3 men. Caleb didn't recognize well-dressed outsiders who looked like they might be company officials rather than local law enforcement. Behind them came Deputy Collins, his expression suggesting that he was present under orders rather than by choice. They dismounted near the office building and began what appeared to be an inspection tour of the abandoned facilities. From their gestures and pointed conversations, it was clear they were discussing renovation plans and operational timelines. This wasn't a law enforcement visit. It was a business meeting. Caleb watched from concealment as one of the company men produced a surveyor's map and began pointing out specific locations around the canyon. Dawson nodded frequently and took notes in a small book, while Collins stood slightly apart from the group, his body language suggesting discomfort with whatever was being discussed. The meeting lasted about an hour, during which time Caleb learned enough to confirm his worst fears. The company planned to resume mining operations within months, and they expected full cooperation from local law enforcement in managing any community resistance. Dawson was being paid not just to ignore evidence of contamination, but to actively suppress any investigation that might reveal the truth about both past and present poisoning campaigns. When the group finally departed, Caleb remained hidden until their hoofbeats faded completely. Then he emerged from the office building with stolen documents burning like fire against his chest and a clear understanding of what he had to do. The ride back to Cordelia's hidden valley seemed to take forever, though Caleb pushed his horse harder than was wise on the treacherous mountain trails. Every minute of delay meant more poison entering Pine Ridge's water supply, more children falling ill, more families suffering while corrupt. Officials and corporate interests profited from their pain. He found Cordelia tending to a new patient, a young doe that had apparently been injured by a trap and sought refuge in the valley. She looked up as he approached, immediately reading the urgency in his expression. "You've found something." "I've found everything." He handed her the stolen documents. watching her face change as she read through the evidence of 30 years of conspiracy and murder. Your family wasn't killed by disease, Cordelia. They were murdered for their land, and the same people are doing it again. She read in silence for several minutes, her face cycling through emotions that ranged from vindication to rage, to a cold determination that was somehow more frightening than either. When she finally looked up, her eyes held the kind of resolve that had built civilizations and toppled empires. "Now we know the truth," she said quietly. "The question is what we're going to do about it." As if in answer to her question, the sound of distant gunshots echoed across the mountains, multiple weapons firing in rapid succession. The sound came from the direction of Pine Ridge, and even at this distance, Caleb could hear the underlying note of panic that suggested something terrible was happening in the valley below. "They're not waiting for us to expose them," Caleb realized. "They're moving to eliminate any threat to their plans." Cordelia was already gathering her medical supplies and preparing for rapid departure. "Then we have no choice but to move faster than they expect. It's time to return to Pine Ridge, Mr. Walker. Time to finish what my husband started 30 years ago." The gunshots had stopped by the time they reached the ridge overlooking Pine Ridge, but smoke rising from the town center told a story of violence and chaos that made Caleb's stomach clench with dread. Through his field glasses, he could see people running through the streets, and what looked like barricades had been erected around the church and several other buildings. "Dear God," Cordelia whispered. Her own glasses focused on the scene below. "What have they done?" From their elevated position, they could make out armed men positioned at strategic points throughout the town. Some wore deputy badges, but others were clearly outsiders. The same well-dressed company men Caleb had observed at the mining office, now revealing themselves as something far more dangerous than corporate executives. "It's a takeover," Caleb realized. "They're not waiting for people to flee voluntarily. They're forcing them out." Movement near the church caught his attention. A group of townspeople, including several families with children, were being herded into the building by armed guards. Dr. Morrison was among them, his medical bag clutched in one hand while he supported Mrs. Harrison with the other. Even from this distance, Caleb could see the fear and confusion on their faces. "They're using the sick children as leverage," Cordelia said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Hold the families hostage while they complete their land acquisition. Anyone who resists loses their children." The diabolical efficiency of the plan was breathtaking in its cruelty. By creating a health crisis and then positioning themselves as both the cause and potential solution, the mining company could force entire families to sign over their property rights in exchange for their children's lives. It was extortion on a scale that defied comprehension. "How many people are we looking at?" Caleb asked, trying to count the armed figures scattered throughout the town. "At least 15 that I can see, probably more inside the buildings. Too many for a direct confrontation, even if we had the weapons for it." They spent the next hour developing a plan that balanced desperate urgency with cold pragmatism. The children in the church were dying. They could see Dr. Morrison moving frantically between patients, his body language speaking of medical crisis and insufficient resources. But a rescue attempt that got them all killed would help no one. "The water supply," Cordelia said finally. "If we can stop the contamination at its source and get the real medicine to those children, we might be able to turn the situation around. People will fight back once they understand what's really happening. And how do we manage that with half the town under armed guard? We don't fight their strength, Mr. Walker. We attack their weakness." She pointed toward the eastern edge of town, where a small building sat apart from the main cluster of structures. "That's the water treatment facility, where they're introducing the contamination into Pine Ridge's supply. It's only lightly guarded because they don't expect anyone to target it." Caleb studied the building through his glasses. 2 men were visible near the entrance, but they seemed more focused on watching the main street than protecting their position. It was clearly considered a low-priority target. If we can neutralize the guards and shut down the contamination system, the children should start recovering within hours. But we'll need to get the antidote to Dr. Morrison before the company realizes what we've done. What about the evidence? Those documents prove everything, but they won't matter if the company destroys them, along with everyone who's seen them. Cordelia reached into her medical bag and withdrew a small leather portfolio that Caleb hadn't seen before. I've been carrying more than healing supplies. Mr. Walker, some documentation of my own that corroborates what you found at the mining office. She opened the portfolio to reveal carefully preserved papers, copies of original land deeds, witness statements from the 1851 outbreak, even a few photographs that somehow captured the horror of that earlier crisis. It was evidence that had been hidden for 30 years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. My husband was thorough in his investigation, even when he knew it would likely cost him his life. He made sure the truth would survive, even if he didn't. As they finalized their approach strategy, Deputy Collins appeared on the main street below, moving with the careful tension of a man walking through hostile territory. He wasn't accompanied by any of the company guards, and his body language suggested he was operating independently of Sheriff Dawson's orders. Collins might be an ally, Caleb observed. He's been asking the right questions, and he doesn't look comfortable with what's happening down there. Or he could be positioning himself to capture us when we make our move. Trust is a luxury we can't afford right now. They waited until dusk began to settle over the valley, using the fading light to mask their descent toward the town. Cordelia had prepared a concentrated dose of antidote that could be administered to multiple children quickly, while Caleb carried the stolen documents wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture and damage. The approach to the water treatment facility required crossing open ground that offered little concealment, but the guards' attention remained focused on the main street where occasional shouts and the sound of breaking glass suggested ongoing confrontations between townspeople and company enforcers as they crept closer. Caleb could hear conversation between the two guards that confirmed their worst fears about the scope of the operation. How much longer before the boss says we can wrap this up? One guard asked, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to violence. Soon as the last families sign over their deeds. Most of them are ready to cave already. Hard to hold out when your kids are choking on their own blood. What about the ones who won't sign? Same thing that happened to the troublemakers 30 years ago. Sometimes people have accidents, you know. Falls down mine shafts, riding accidents, that sort of thing. The conversation ended abruptly as both guards snapped to attention. Someone was approaching their position, footsteps crunching on gravel in the darkness beyond the treatment facility. Caleb pressed himself against the building's stone foundation and motioned for Cordelia to remain hidden behind a stack of equipment. Deputy Collins emerged from the darkness, his hands visible and empty, but his posture suggesting readiness for trouble. The guards relaxed slightly when they recognized him, but didn't lower their weapons entirely. Collins, what brings you out here instead of keeping an eye on the hostages? Sheriff sent me to check on the water situation. Wants to make sure nothing's interfering with the treatment process. One of the guards laughed harshly. Treatment process? That's a good one. Yeah, we're treating the water real good, adding just enough mercury to keep those kids sick without killing them too fast. Collins's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight stiffening of his shoulders, a change in his breathing pattern that spoke of moral revulsion, held carefully in check. In that moment, Caleb realized that the deputy was indeed a potential ally, a man who had stumbled into a conspiracy far darker than anything he'd signed up for when he'd taken his oath of office. How long before the contamination reaches peak effectiveness? Collins asked, his voice maintaining professional neutrality despite what Caleb could see was growing internal conflict. Should be fully distributed through the system within the hour. After that, any kid who drinks the water is going to get real sick real fast. Might even lose a few before their parents get motivated to sign those property transfers. Collins nodded slowly, then moved with sudden, decisive action. His fist connected with the first guard's jaw in a blow that dropped the man instantly. while his other hand drew his revolver and pressed it against the second guard's temple before the man could react. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't even breathe loud," Collins whispered with deadly intensity. "You're going to show me exactly how this contamination system works, and then you're going to help me shut it down." Caleb rose from concealment, his own weapon drawn, but pointed safely downward. "Deputy Collins, glad to see you're on the right side of this." Collins spun toward him, gun still trained on the conscious guard. "Walker, what the hell are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, I suspect. Trying to stop innocent people from being murdered for corporate profit." Cordelia emerged from her hiding place, moving with the calm dignity that had characterized her throughout this crisis. Collins' eyes widened as he recognized her from the wanted posters that had been circulating throughout the territory. "You're Cordelia Blackthorne, the witch woman everyone's been hunting." "I'm a healer, Deputy. And right now, I'm the only person in this valley who knows how to save those children." Collins looked between Caleb and Cordelia, his mind clearly racing through the implications of what he'd discovered. Finally, he made a decision that would define the rest of his career and quite possibly the rest of his life. "Then let's save them. But first we need to shut down this contamination system before it gets worse." The guard, prompted by Collins' gun and Caleb's intimidating presence, led them into the treatment facility and showed them how the mercury compounds were being introduced into Pine Ridge's water supply. The system was diabolically simple, a series of injection ports that allowed precise control over contamination levels, ensuring that the poisoning could be graduated to achieve maximum psychological impact without killing so many people that outside authorities would be forced to investigate. "Shut it down," Collins ordered. "All of it. And show me how to purge the contaminated water from the system." As they worked to reverse the contamination process, Cordelia prepared her antidotes and Caleb studied the stolen documents by lamplight. The evidence was overwhelming. Decades of conspiracy, murder, and corporate malfeasance that reached far beyond Pine Ridge to implicate powerful interests throughout Colorado territory. "This is bigger than we thought," he told Collins. "This company has been using the same methods in mining towns throughout the region. Pine Ridge isn't their first victim, and it won't be their last unless we stop them here. Then we'd better make sure we stop them permanently," Collins replied grimly. "Because once they realize what we've done, they're going to come after us with everything they've got." Outside, the sounds of conflict were escalating. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls with increasing frequency, suggesting that the situation in town was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Time was running out faster than any of them had anticipated. "The children first," Cordelia said firmly. "Whatever else happens, we get the antidote to those children before this gets any worse." As they prepared to leave the water treatment facility, Caleb realized that they were about to walk into the most dangerous situation of their lives. But looking at his companions, a corrupt system's honest deputy, a woman seeking justice for murdered family and himself, a man who'd found purpose in protecting the innocent, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. He felt like part of something larger than himself, something worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The church doors were guarded by 2 company men with rifles, but their attention was focused on the growing crowd of angry townspeople who had begun to gather in the street, despite the obvious danger. Word had somehow spread that families were being held hostage inside, and Pine Ridge was finally beginning to show the kind of collective courage that might have prevented this crisis if it had emerged sooner. Caleb, Cordelia, and Collins approached through the alley behind the church, using the building's bulk to shield them from the guards' line of sight. The sounds from inside were heartbreaking. Children coughing and crying, parents whispering desperate prayers, Dr. Morrison's voice raised in increasingly frantic medical consultations. "Back entrance," Collins whispered. "Sacristy door," Cordelia replied. "Should be unlocked from the inside, but there might be guards." They found the small door that provided access to the church's preparation area, and Caleb carefully tested the handle. It turned freely, revealing a narrow hallway that led toward the main sanctuary. Voices drifted from that direction. Dr. Morrison explaining to terrified parents that he was running out of conventional treatments. These children need immediate medical attention that I simply cannot provide with the resources available here, Morrison was saying. If we don't get them to a proper hospital soon, we're going to start losing them. Nobody's going anywhere until their parents sign the property transfers, came a harsh voice that Caleb recognized as one of the company enforcers. Kids get better when their families cooperate. Simple as that. Collins's jaw tightened with controlled rage. They're literally holding children's lives hostage for land deals. Cordelia was already preparing syringes of antidote, her movements precise despite the urgency of the situation. Get me to those children, and I can start reversing the effects immediately. But I'll need Dr. Morrison's cooperation to make sure the treatments are administered correctly. Leave Morrison to me, Caleb said. He knows who I am, and he's already seen what your medicines can do. He'll help once he understands what's really happening. They moved through the sacristy and into the main sanctuary, where the scope of the crisis became immediately apparent. At least a dozen children lay on makeshift beds throughout the church, their faces flushed with fever and their breathing labored. Parents knelt beside them, some praying, others simply holding small hands and trying to provide whatever comfort they could. Dr. Morrison looked up as they entered, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and finally desperate hope as he recognized Cordelia and the medical supplies she carried. "Thank God," he whispered. "Are those more of the medicines that helped the first children?" "Better than that, Doctor. These are antidotes specifically formulated to counteract mercury and arsenic poisoning." Morrison's expression sharpened with professional interest. "You're saying these children were deliberately poisoned?" "We're saying a lot more than that," Collins interrupted, his deputy's badge gleaming in the candlelight. "We're saying this entire crisis was manufactured by Consolidated Mining Company to force property transfers. And we have documentation to prove it." The conversations throughout the church had stopped as people realized that something significant was happening near the altar. Parents began moving closer, hope and suspicion warring in their faces as they tried to understand whether these newcomers represented salvation or additional danger. "You're the woman they've been hunting," Mrs. Harrison said, recognizing Cordelia despite her exhaustion and fear. "The witch woman." "I'm a healer, Mrs. Harrison, and these children were poisoned by the same people who are holding you hostage." Cordelia's voice carried across the sanctuary with calm authority. 30 years ago, my own children died from identical poisoning. I've spent 3 decades learning how to prevent it from happening again." The revelation rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Parents who had been terrorized by supernatural explanations began to grasp the human evil that was actually threatening their families. The change in atmosphere was immediate and electric, fear transforming into anger, desperation becoming determination. "They poisoned our children." Tom Henderson's voice cracked with emotion. "For land deals? Show them," Collins said to Caleb. "Show them the documents." Caleb unwrapped the stolen papers and began reading from the company correspondence, his voice carrying clearly throughout the church. As the details emerged, the deliberate contamination, the bribery of local officials, the connection to events from 30 years ago, the crowd's anger grew into something far more dangerous than the company enforcers had prepared to handle. Outside, raised voices suggested that the guards had noticed something unusual was happening inside the church. Footsteps could be heard moving around the building's perimeter, and someone was testing the main doors to ensure they remained secure. "We need to start treating these children immediately," Cordelia said, already moving toward the sickest patients. "Dr. Morrison, I'll need your help administering the antidotes and monitoring their responses." As Morrison moved to assist her, Cordelia reached into her medical bag and withdrew something that made several people gasp in recognition. It was her mother's wedding ring, tarnished with age, but still bearing the delicate engravings that marked it as a family heirloom. She had found it, she explained quietly, in the ruins of her old home, evidence that her family's murder had been thorough and deliberate. "This is what they took from me 30 years ago," she said, holding the ring up for everyone to see. "Not just my family, but my entire life, my place in this community, my chance to help people the way I was trained to do. They won't take these children too." The church doors burst open with a crash that echoed off the stone walls like thunder. Sheriff Dawson stood framed in the entrance, his face twisted with rage and his gun drawn. Behind him came 3 company enforcers, their weapons trained on the crowd of families who instinctively moved to shield their children. Well, Dawson said, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Looks like we've finally found our missing witch woman. And it appears she's brought some friends." Collins stepped forward, his own weapon drawn but not yet aimed at his superior. "Sheriff, these people have evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. Consolidated Mining Company has been deliberately poisoning the town's water supply." Dawson's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Evidence? Collins, you naive fool. I've been getting paid to suppress evidence for 30 years. You think some old papers are going to change anything now?" The admission sent a shock through the assembled townspeople. Whatever lingering doubts they might have harbored about the scope of the conspiracy evaporated in the face of their sheriff's blatant confession. "You murdered my husband," Cordelia said, rising from beside the child she'd been treating. Her voice was steady, but her eyes blazed with 3 decades of suppressed fury. "You killed Thomas to protect your mining company masters." Thomas Blackthorne was a bleeding heart who couldn't understand the realities of frontier economics. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Progress. Dr. Morrison looked up from where he was administering antidote to one of the sickest children. "You call murdering families and poisoning children progress? I call it business, Doctor. The same business that's kept this town alive and growing for 30 years. The same business that's going to make us all rich if people are smart enough to cooperate." One of the company enforcers moved closer to Cordelia, his rifle trained on her chest. "Should have stayed in exile, old woman. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." But as he spoke, something extraordinary was happening throughout the church. The children who had received Cordelia's antidote were beginning to show signs of improvement. Color was returning to their faces, their breathing was becoming easier, and some of the younger ones were actually sitting up and looking around with clear, alert eyes. Little Sarah Mitchell, who'd been unconscious when they'd arrived, suddenly opened her eyes and called out for her mother. The sound of her voice, strong and clear for the first time in days, galvanized everyone in the church. "Look at them," Mrs. Harrison said in wonder, moving toward her own grandson, who was showing similar signs of recovery. "They're getting better." She really did save them. The transformation was undeniable and immediate. Parents who had spent days watching their children waste away from mysterious illness were witnessing a medical miracle that demolished every supernatural explanation that had been offered. This wasn't witchcraft. This was healing, pure and simple. "Impossible," one of the enforcers muttered. "They were supposed to get worse, not better." "Because we shut down your contamination system," Collins said, his gun now pointed directly at Dawson. "No more mercury in the water, no more poisoned children. Your whole operation is finished." Dawson's expression shifted from confidence to desperation as he realized that his carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing around him. "You have no idea what you've done, Collins. This company has resources you can't imagine. They'll destroy this entire town before they let themselves be exposed. Then maybe it's time Pine Ridge stopped being afraid of bullies," Tom Henderson said, stepping forward with a courage born of seeing his niece recovering. "Maybe it's time we stood up for ourselves." Other parents began moving forward as well, forming a protective circle around Cordelia and the children. The sight of their young ones healing had transformed them from frightened victims into determined defenders. "Sheriff," Cordelia said, reaching into her medical bag one final time, "there's something else you should see." She withdrew a blood-stained letter bearing the Consolidated Mining Company letterhead, the final piece of evidence that had fallen from Dawson's coat during his struggle with Caleb, the letter contained explicit instructions for eliminating witnesses to the company's contamination operations, including specific mention of Cordelia Blackthorne and anyone who might be helping her. "This fell out of your pocket during our last conversation," she said calmly. "Interesting reading, particularly the part about making sure no one survives to testify about the company's activities." Dawson's face went pale as he recognized the document. In that moment, everyone in the church could see the full scope of his guilt written in his expression. This wasn't just corruption. This was premeditated murder on a massive scale. "You were going to kill all of us," Dr. Morrison said in horrified realization. "Everyone who knew about the poisoning. Everyone who could connect the company to what happened. Sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good," Dawson replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He was a man whose carefully constructed lies were finally crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. Collins stepped closer to his superior, his weapon steady and his voice filled with the authority of moral certainty. "Sheriff Jackson Dawson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to homicide, and corruption of public office." "You can't arrest me, Collins. I'm your superior officer, not anymore. As of right now, you're just another criminal." 1 month later, Pine Ridge had transformed into something Caleb barely recognized. The simple wooden sign hanging outside Dr. Morrison's office read, "C. Blackthorne, healer," in neat black letters, and the steady stream of patients seeking her services spoke to a community that had finally learned to distinguish between healing and superstition. Children who had been dying just weeks earlier now played in the streets with the boundless energy that only the truly healthy possess. Caleb paused outside the office, watching through the window as Cordelia examined a rancher's injured arm, while Dr. Morrison took careful notes. Their partnership had revolutionized medical care in the valley, combining traditional frontier medicine with herbal treatments that had been refined over generations of careful practice. Morrison had even begun documenting Cordelia's methods, creating a comprehensive guide that could be shared with other frontier doctors throughout the territory. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" Caleb turned to find Deputy Collins, now Sheriff Collins, following a special election that had removed Dawson's appointees from office, approaching with his own small smile of satisfaction. "That she is. How are the trials proceeding?" "Better than anyone expected. With the documentation you found and Cordelia's testimony about what happened 30 years ago, the territorial court is building cases that reach far beyond Pine Ridge. Consolidated Mining Company is facing criminal charges in 3 territories, and their stock price has collapsed completely. The trials had become something of a sensation throughout Colorado Territory, drawing newspaper reporters and legal observers from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. The evidence of systematic poisoning and murder had shocked even frontier communities accustomed to corporate violence, and the legal precedents being established would influence mining law for decades to come. What about the other mining towns? The ones where they use similar methods? Investigation teams are being dispatched to 6 different communities. If the pattern holds, we'll be dealing with dozens of additional criminal cases and hundreds of families seeking compensation for poisoning and property theft. Caleb nodded, thinking about the scope of justice that was finally beginning to emerge after 30 years of carefully hidden crimes. And the land rights? All property seized through fraudulent means is being returned to the original owners or their heirs. Cordelia will get back her family's land, along with mineral rights that are worth considerably more than they were in 1851. It was poetic justice of the highest order. The woman who had lost everything to corporate greed would ultimately profit from the very resources that had motivated her family's murder. More importantly, she would have the financial independence to continue her healing work without concern for profit or payment. The office door opened, and Cordelia emerged with her patient, providing final instructions about wound care and promising to check on his progress in a few days. The rancher thanked her with the genuine warmth of someone whose pain had been relieved by skilled hands and genuine compassion. "Mr. Walker," she said, noticing him for the first time. "How good to see you. I was just thinking we should take that ride you promised me." She gestured toward the hitching post where 2 horses waited, his faithful mountain companion and the horse he had given her that first morning on the trail. The sight of them together seemed to symbolize everything that had changed in their lives and in Pine Ridge itself. "Where did you have in mind?" "The old homestead. I want to see what remains of the life Thomas and I tried to build." They rode in comfortable silence through valleys that were already showing signs of recovery from decades of mining contamination. With the poisoning stopped and natural processes allowed to resume, streams were running clearer and vegetation was returning to areas that had been barren for years. The land itself seemed to be healing, just as the community had begun to heal from the trauma of fear and manipulation. The Blackthorn homestead sat in a meadow that overlooked the entire Pine Ridge Valley, its foundation stones still marking the outline of what had once been a substantial house. Wildflowers had grown up through the ruins, and aspens had taken root where the kitchen garden had once flourished. Nature had reclaimed the space, but traces of human habitation remained for those who knew how to look. Cordelia dismounted and walked slowly through the ruins, her fingers trailing over stone foundations and wooden beams that had somehow survived 3 decades of weather and neglect. In the space that had once been the main room, she knelt and carefully brushed away debris until she found what she was looking for, a small depression. In the stone where a hearthstone had once sat, Thomas carved our initials. "Here the day we finished building the house," she said, tracing the faded letters with infinite tenderness. "He said it would mark this as our place forever, no matter what else might happen." Caleb watched her face as she reconnected with memories that had sustained her through 30 years of exile and struggle. There was sadness there, certainly, but also a kind of peace that spoke of wounds finally beginning to heal. "Will you rebuild?" "I've been thinking about that. The location is perfect for a proper healing center, close enough to town for easy access, but isolated enough for people who need extended treatment. Dr. Morrison thinks we could establish the first real medical school in this part of the territory." The vision she described was ambitious but achievable, especially with the resources that would be available through the legal settlements. Pine Ridge could become a center for medical learning and healing arts, drawing practitioners from throughout the West who wanted to learn from the woman who had revolutionized frontier medicine. "Sounds like you'll need help building something that substantial." Cordelia looked up from the ruins with a smile that held 30 years of deferred hope. "Are you offering, Mr. Walker?" "I'm thinking a man could do worse than partnering with the finest healer in Colorado territory." As the sun set over the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, they sat together in the ruins of the old life and planned the foundation of something new. The children of Pine Ridge were healthy and safe. The conspiracy that had threatened them was broken beyond repair, and 2 people who had found each other through an act of simple kindness were discovering that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. In the distance, the sound of church bells carried across the valley, not calling people to prayer this time, but celebrating the marriage of Tom Henderson's eldest daughter. Life was returning to normal in Pine Ridge, but it was a better normal than the community had ever known before, built on truth instead of fear and strengthened by the knowledge that ordinary people could defeat extraordinary evil when they chose to stand together. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness carry the greatest weight, and sometimes when you help a stranger on a mountain trail, you save more than just one person. You save an entire community and discover that your own life has been transformed in the process.